So we will be analyzing the tennis backhand. First, we will be watching some videos. This is a front view of Bree doing the backhand. You can see she's in a preparatory, and then she goes to the swing, and then the follow through. The next day we'll see she will be hitting a ball, so it'll look a little different because she's tossing the ball. So she tosses the ball, then she puts both hands on the racket in the preparatory, going through the swing, and now the follow through. The tennis backhand can either be a one-handed or a two-handed move. We will focus on the two-handed, and it can be used as a baseline shot or an approach shot.
Okay, so the tennis backhand has 3 phases. The first one is the preparatory phase, which is this. The second phase is the swing phase, is when you get your contact in the ball. And the third phase and last phase is the follow-through phase, where you end your movement. So the preparatory phase, glenohumeral joint, the motion of this joint is a horizontal adduction. Horizontal adduction is caused by the deltoid, pectoralis major, and the rotator cuff muscles. Deltoid is isometrically contracting, while the pectoralis major is concentrically contracting, and the rotator cuff muscles are eccentrically contracting. The preparatory phase elbow joint is in extension. The elbow extension is caused when the triceps brachii concentrically contracts. For the wrist joint, the wrist is in a neutral position because it's not contracting like at all, and you're just relaxing your wrist. To achieve a neutral wrist position, both the wrist flexors and extensors isometrically contract. The fingers for this phase, the motion of the fingers are in flexion. You're holding the racket. The finger flexion is caused when the finger flexors eccentrically contract.
In the preparatory phase, we got your hip joint. The hips are in a neutral position, and so to achieve that, both the hip flexors and the glutes isometrically contract. And then for the knee joint, your knee is going into flexion, and flexion is caused by the quadriceps eccentrically contracting and the hamstrings concentrically contracting. And then lastly, in the preparatory phase, you have the ankle joint. One ankle is in plantar flexion, and the other ankle is in a neutral position. Ankle plantar flexion is caused by the calves concentrically contracting, and to achieve a neutral position, both the ankle extensors and the flexors isometrically contract. And then your planes and axes for the preparatory phase, you have your glenohumeral joint, which is in the frontal plane and the sagittal axis. You have your elbow joint in the sagittal plane and the frontal axis. Your wrist joint is also in the sagittal plane and frontal axis, as well as your fingers. And then your hip joint is in the transverse plane and the vertical axis. And your knee and ankle joints are both in the sagittal plane and frontal axes. And then next, we start your swing phase with the glenohumeral joint. The motion is horizontal adduction and extension. For horizontal adduction, the anterior deltoid and the rotator cuff muscles concentrically contract, and the posterior deltoid eccentrically contracts. And then extension is caused by the pectoralis major and eccentrically contracting.
So the next joint we have in the swing phase is the elbow joint. It is an extension. Elbow extension is caused when the triceps brachii isometrically contracts. Next we have the wrist joint. So the wrist is in a neutral position. As you can see when Issa stands, it's just like the preparatory phase, so the wrist doesn't really move throughout the whole motion. The wrist is in a neutral position. Both the wrist flexors and extensors are isometrically contracted. Next we have the fingers. So they are in flexion the whole time because they are gripping the racket. Finger flexion is caused by finger flexors isometrically contracting. Next we have the hip joint. The hips are in a neutral position. To achieve a neutral position, both the hip flexors and the glutes isometrically contract. Lastly, we have the knee joint. The knees are in extension the whole time. Knee extension is caused by the quadriceps concentrically contracting, by the hamstrings eccentrically contracting.
Alright, so for the swing phase, now for the ankle joint, one ankle is in dorsiflexion while the other ankle is in a neutral position. Ankle dorsiflexion is caused by the calves eccentrically contracting. To achieve a neutral position, both the ankle extensors and flexors isometrically contract. For the planes and axes of the swing phase, the glenohumeral joint is in the frontal plane while it's in the sagittal axis. The elbow joint is the sagittal plane and the frontal axis. The wrist joint is sagittal plane and the frontal axis. The fingers are sagittal plane and the frontal axis. The hip joint is transverse plane and vertical axis. The knee joint is sagittal plane and frontal axis, while the ankle joint is sagittal plane and frontal axis. For the follow-through phase, you end with the racket behind your back here, and your elbows are bent, and the motion is horizontal adduction. Horizontal adduction is caused by the pectoralis major and the rotator cuff muscles eccentrically contracting, and the anterior deltoid isometrically contracting. For the elbow joint, motion is extension, and the elbow extension is caused when the triceps brachii eccentrically contracts. For the wrist joint, is in neutral position as it's gripping the racket the whole time, and it needs to stay as a tight grip. It doesn't change. To achieve a neutral position, the wrist has both the wrist flexors and extensors isometrically contract.
And now for the follow-through phase with the fingers. The motion that the fingers are still in is obviously flexion. They're flexed the entire time. The finger flexion is caused by the finger flexors in the hand and wrist isometrically contracting. In the hip joint, the hips are in a neutral position, and then to achieve that neutral position, both the hip flexors and the glutes will be isometrically contracted. In the knee joint, you are flexed, and the knee flexion is caused by quadriceps and hamstrings isometrically contracting together. The follow-through phase during the ankle joint, one ankle is going to be in dorsiflexion while the other ankle isn't going to be in a neutral position. The ankle dorsiflexion is caused by the calves isometrically contracting, and to achieve a neutral position, both the ankle extension and flexors will need to isometrically contract. The planes and axes in the follow-through phase, the glenohumeral joint is in the frontal plane and the sagittal axis. The elbow joint, the wrist joint, and the fingers are all on the sagittal plane and the frontal axis. The hip joint is in the transverse plane and vertical axis, and like the elbow, wrist, and fingers, the knee and the ankle joint will also be in the sagittal plane and the frontal axis. Common injuries that can occur during tennis for anything, even backhand, forehand, anything, is lateral epicondylitis, which is also known as tennis elbow, and it's just inflammation of the wrist extensors at the site at the lateral epicondyle. The medial epicondylitis is going to be about the same thing except on the medial side of the elbow, and it's also known as golfer's elbow. Biceps brachii tendonitis is inflammation of the biceps brachii tendon where it inserts, and decurvain tenosynovitis is inflammation of your sheath over your thumb tendons. Injury prevention, there's many ways to prevent injuries, like correct racket weight, correct grip size, and even just correct grip on the tennis racket, correct hand grip and placement, correct shoes, adequate rest in between sessions, and then we have like different improper mechanics that cause the injuries that you shouldn't do to prevent these injuries. So Issa is going to show us a few examples.
Like when you don't bend your knees, you're trying to get your knees like extremely, like the extension of the knees that can hurt you if you just, I don't know,
Swing it like a baseball bat.
swing like how you're not supposed to swing a tennis racket. Your hips, if you like try to get all your strength, all your power from your hips, you're probably gonna get hurt as well.
And just doing those simple things can help prevent injuries.